So welcome on my behalf. I'm Tuuli Mattermäki. I'm Associate Professor of Design at the Department of Design in Aalto University School of Arts, Design and Architecture. And I'm one of the members in the Creatures project. And this seminar today is part of the informal seminar series of Creatures, Creative Practice for Transformational Futures. And what we are doing here is trying to understand, on one hand, what the creative practices and practitioners are about, but also how they are part of the socio-ecological transformation. And one of our sister projects is Artsformation, and we have the fortune to have Christian Fiesler here today. And Christian Fiesler is a professor for communication management at the Norwegian Business School and the founding director of the Nordic Center for Internet and Society. He received his PhD in management and economics from the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. And he has also worked in Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University and at Stanford University. And his research interests center on organizational identity, corporate social responsibility, and computer-mediated communication. His research is focused on the questions how individuals and organizations adapt to shift brought by new social media, and how to design participative and inclusive space in this new media regime. In this field, he has over the last few years worked extensively in projects with the European Union and the Norwegian Research Council on technology and new working modes. So what we are expecting to hear a little bit about the project, like a general overview, but also particular questions dealing with arts formation research questions and a little bit of the artistic activities there. Is that right, Christian?
Sounds very good. Yeah, good morning, everybody. I guess the eternal question whether 12 o'clock is good morning or good afternoon. I guess for the Finnish colleagues, it's more afternoon, but let's go with good morning for now. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm part of the Artsformation Consortium, help to organize that. And if that is okay for you, I would maybe propose to maybe do a short overview, like 20 minutes about the project. Please always ask questions and just challenge me. And the idea is, I guess, also because I'm presenting also on behalf of others. If you're interested in particular aspects, which I will explain in a second, I would happily connect you to the different parties. Let me maybe share my screen just real quick, because then I can make it visual. Here we go. So yeah, like Tuuli just said, right? We at Artsformation are one of your sister projects, and our special niche, our special research and innovation question is whether or not the arts can be a meaningful voice for designing, creating, imagining a better, more inclusive digital transformation. By way of background, or a little bit more formally, we are supposed to explore and empower the potential of the arts. Lower letter arts, I think we can speak about that more if you're interested in that, but we are interested in fine arts and in more art brut, so essentially also like more non-professional, more casual forms of the art. The potential of the lower letter arts to facilitate a more equitable and sustainable digital transformation. We are 9 institutions, 3 universities, together with the colleagues in Copenhagen Business School and the engineering department at Trinity College Dublin. And we are mostly then arts and culture organizations. Transmediale is a electronic arts festival. FACT, the Foundation for Arts and technology in Liverpool, a museum. VAG is a makerspace / technology organizer. European Alternatives Democracy NGO, KEA a policy bureau, and LATRA a makerspace and refugees social issue NGO. And together we essentially explore different facets of the intersection between the arts and digital transformation. To explain, of course, what we mean by digital transformation, and that I have to admit we never really defined in the course of our application, and we still don't really want to, meaning that we essentially want to see what artists and creatives essentially perceive as challenges with the digital transformation. Just to name a few, of course, you could argue that we could have meaningful discussions on whether all our artificial intelligence, how we implement it, all our algorithms are totally fair, whether they are perceivable to people, to everyday people, robotics, Internet of Things, social media, with all the social repercussions for better and for worse, right? The meaningful qualifier is for better and for worse. The project is not really about just saying that everything about the digital transformation is bad, very much to the contrary. But it's always, of course, kind of like how you design it, right? How you include people and whether we can find optimal ways to be inclusive about that. Yeah, so how do, for instance, the art can come up with any meaningful ideas, for instance, how we can arguably lift our democracies out of crisis, which arguably, again, is somewhat intersected by matters of information quality, news quality, quality of public discourse. How do we deal with privacy and surveillance? How do we deal, for instance, with also economic shifts? We are then interested in the artist perspectives and contribution towards digital transformation. And then, and it will become a little bit clearer when I talk about the different work packages, we are very much interested in not only displays of arts, I think that's a good way of putting that, but also how arts play together with organizations. I guess that's not unfamiliar to you guys. I spoke to Tuli about that yesterday, but oftentimes when you talk to people outside of the arts, it is it sometimes needs a little bit of convincing that art essentially goes beyond the white walls of an exhibition space, right? Like many people think about the arts of being something which is essentially the artwork, but arguably a lot of arts nowadays also is intertwined with the process of organizing artist in residencies, arts-based enterprises, which arguably a really interesting way of connecting the arts and technologists and how we think about transformations. We are interested in arts in society, so not only about how they interplay with organizations like technology firms and policymakers, but also NGOs and grassroots organizations. And the idea is then we have a strong, in European Union terms, I think it would be called a, sorry, just reading the chat. It is also about bringing artists together, engaging the public through exhibitions and developing arts-based methods, which in the end, hopefully, let's see how that goes, but we want to essentially bring decision makers together with artists to explore some new ways of thinking a little bit more inclusively about how we design technology. And of course, the whole organizational, managerial, financial apparatus, which is of course connected to technology, right? It's not only about designing technology, but about technology in action. Just some examples. It's not our artwork that comes later, right? But again, you might also be familiar with that. But there are lots actually of interesting examples where artists in one way or the other are making commentaries about digital transformation. Here, artwork by Harvey on facial recognition, on essentially how to disrupt facial recognition, reminiscent of then called dazzle camouflage, but essentially facial makeup that can throw off facial recognition algorithms. To the right, it's a series of artwork where artists essentially create 3D printed masks, which are also, simplifying a little bit, but throwing off surveillance mechanisms or feeding intentional data to surveillance systems. There's art, for instance, also commenting on, actually quite topical nowadays. And I think there's an interesting artwork. That's an artwork from 2019 by Anna Riddler and David Fau on blockchain, right? Blockchain, I guess you might be familiar with the current discussions we're having in the art world about art tech and non-fungible tokens and digital art being monetized. And that's actually a little bit of a predecessor in that the artist created a number of tulips, right? Reminiscence of this whole tulip speculation craze of the 17th centuries, where they computer generated images of tulips and sold them on the blockchain. I think that was pre-NFT days even. Point being here, it's an interesting commentary on speculation, but also on essentially on what constitutes value, especially because if you think about the innovation chain, right? That is 2019, NFTs, the whole market in the art market became commercially viable this year, 2021, and blockchain technology and non-fungible tokens are arguably not something that in 5 years will be big in the art market, but will surely be big in real estate or something else, right? So the arts, arguably, and especially the fine arts, might in some instances have a little bit of a canary type of character, right? Something which very early is able to sense certain developments, signals, ideas, which if somehow reflected well enough, could be, we argue, quite informative for being a little bit more prepared to shape policies, technologies, trajectories early. Arguably, there is a lot of good things with the art. Sorry for being a little bit flippant, right? So kind of like on the next two slides, that's a little bit our internal problem definition, because arguably when you work with an Horizon project, you need to have a project, you need to somewhat argue that there's something wrong, not wrong, but something is in need of improvement, right? And of course, we can learn from the arts and how we can enable artists. And this is now, of course, also me speaking as a business school person, other colleagues from engineering. Arguably, art is good in amplifying ideas, finding unconventional solutions, inspiring stakeholders across spheres, investors, example, NFTs, right? Non-fungible tokens, which are right now a multi-billion euro-dollar speculation, which interestingly enough is essentially beta tested kind of in the arts, right? How it challenges path-dependent thinking, so having a little bit of a radical different opinion, how it might give marginalized populations a voice, and might offer engineers a way to put technology to use, this whole idea of tinkering and engineering solutions, sometimes looking for a proper application, and this then maybe tested out in something whimsical like the arts first. The problem arguably is, of course, that a lot of the arts is a one-off, has something to do, of course, with the artistic process, is not really well translated into and received in other spheres. So when it comes really down to the nitty-gritty of going beyond essentially the immediate impetus of creating art, but engaging longer term with communities or organizations or even a particular technology, and really going into depth into that. And arts oftentimes only reaches a specific group of people. And the idea now with the project is to, and again, that's a little bit, of course, over-exaggerated. It has something to do with kind of like how these projects work, right? But we are interested in how, in the context of the digital transformation, how can the arts be systematically amplified and leveraged through, for instance, training, field workshops, bringing artists together. I want to essentially show you what we do to work a little bit towards making the situation better or more better, right? So our project essentially is 3 research areas. One on what you see here is WP2, artistic transformations, concerned with the perspective of the artist. So who are the artists that in one way or the other create artwork in the widest possible sense on transformations, on digital transformations. The next work package is interested in how artists intersect with organizations. So essentially that is a question of which organizations, companies, municipalities, policymakers, in how far do they have any interplay with artists? So do they have artists in residencies? Are artists in one way or the other a certain organized actor on the market? And we have another 3rd work package here, WP4, on how artists work together with work on social issues, participatory art also, but also how they increasingly, or at least some artist groups increasingly, form social startups, you could argue, social enterprises in a way, which is an interesting combination between the arts and looking for more organized or long-term solutions to remedy certain social issues. I will talk about some examples in a second, but there are, for instance, artistic projects in creating cheaper, better tech for underserved populations. There's something about bringing certain people into employment. We have then 2 more work packages which are more concerned about bringing artists together. We'll explain that in a second. Artist spaces. So we have a number of artist residencies where we bring them together for art making, and we have a more exhibition slash festival slash art workshop type of element that we call productions, and then policy and dissemination. To explain a little bit what we think nowadays, so after a year, I think we are somewhat on a similar time frame as you guys. We have, and there are of course many reports behind that, not many, but here now speaking about 2 reports on the artist perspective. We are right now thinking in terms of it sounds now a little bit academic. I will keep it short, no worries. But when it comes to the interplay of arts and transformation, we at this point a little bit between literature search to have a little bit of a theoretical perspective on it, combined with now exercises in mapping. So who are the artists? Before that, we worked a little bit on a arguably theoretical perspective where we are very much inspired by literature on care. So the idea of, you see it here on the left, essentially inspired by French philosophers like Bernard Stiegler on essentially kind of the dual role of the arts, that the art can in a way re-enchant how we see the world, right? Essentially creating a sense of wonder and agency, very inspiring for engineers, for instance, when creating technology. The arts is good in creating a sense of care, so essentially making people more aware of design requirements and design vulnerabilities when they create. The idea of imagination, if you think about speculative reading and how, for instance, speculative fiction, science fiction inspires engineers, and the idea of empowerment capabilities. And we theoretically are a little bit working with that perspective, that we think in terms of in how far can the arts do one of these 4 things. Of course, always for the better or for the worse, right? It's always not as easy as saying that you apply art to something and automatically things become better. And arguably also it has to do with individual perspectives, because of course art has, of course, always an inspiration function to the individual, but it also is something which can collectively be enjoyed. We in particular are also doing nowadays, beginning to, right? We had, I think, similar problems like you guys in that we were under lockdown for 1.5 years and are a little bit behind with our field work. We are right now doing mixture between mapping, so essentially just getting a hold of what is out there, and field work, observation, interviews with artist in residency programs, so essentially larger organizations, Google, Facebook, Autodesk, which have artists in residence, and how they, on the one hand, the artists feel whether they can make their voices heard, but also, of course, people in the organization discussing with us in how far they think this is actually a valuable contribution and where these contributions, a little bit on a meta level, I have to add, right? But where these contributions could be leveraged more. And it goes from, of course, artist in residency programs, but there's nowadays also a sizable group of artists who a little bit hard to define in terms of that they have collectives which in a way also operate like firms, like companies, like social movements. Tactical Tech, for instance, Berlin is one of these examples. And what we do is right now working both parallel on interviews and trying to get a little bit of an order. I don't want to bore you too much with that, but we try to create a little bit of a reference frame, reference order on whether, for instance, particular relationships between organizations and artists, whether they are symmetric, asymmetric, who has the power in this, and how far it is essentially a benefit only derived for the company, whether the company essentially tries to reach out to wider publics. So it's essentially just some elements of order. Our working group on social or community involvement is doing the exact same thing, and not the exact same thing, but we're doing kind of like combined interviews together with all the research work packages, because we kind of like came to the conclusion that it's not really that easy to divide whether an artist in residence is only about product innovation or about also connecting the organization a little bit more to their wider constituencies. In that work package, we are right now also working a lot with organizing workshops where we invite particular artists who then together with us organize workshops where we involve sometimes vulnerable populations, but also oftentimes just the general public on thinking a little bit on what we would argue are social issues connected to the digital transformation. It's a little bit, of course, episodical, because there are many, many issues. You have to start somewhere. So we, for instance, have until now done workshops where we invited artists who then, for us, where we together used art and the community to, for instance, think about how can we get more female voices onto Wikipedia, or more voices of persons of color. We had workshops on composition, so essentially in how far is a musical composition different when an algorithm is involved, and what does it mean, for instance, for the sense of authenticity and authorship and all that. So it's a number of workshops going on there with the idea to then learn a little bit on how artists essentially facilitate that process and how the community resounds to that also in terms of learning and all that. We were also on this, by the way, later producing a MOOC, a massively open online course, essentially on how artists can be a meaningful voice in organizing communities and giving them a voice. So here a little bit as an overview. So what we're essentially doing in our research work packages, we are in the middle of mapping. We already had one report on that, and then combine that with case studies that later hopefully maybe will create a certain guideline or handbook, however you want to call it, which essentially would tell people like, how can we set up a collaboration between an artist and organization, may it be for innovation purposes, may it be for social purposes, and how can we set it up that it is essentially fruitful for everybody involved as best as possible. We then have the two more artistic work packages, one being where we hopefully next year, we had to postpone that for over a year now due to Corona, but we want to bring together 28 artists or 4 groups of 7 artists that has something now to do with Corona to work together for a week on essentially a digital issue. They would do creative art making, and we similarly plan to have a consultancy body, a so-called assembly, where the artist essentially then decide on which issues actually the artist in residential cover, which type of artwork should or should not be commissioned with. Of course, all the organizational difficulties that go with subcontracting, or not subcontracting, but that's something which we are more or less now set on. But the idea is essentially to bring artists together, to hear their voices, to get their input on how we can design a more inclusive digital transformation, and ideally in the process also get some artwork out of that. And by artwork in the widest possible sense, right? Can be a performance, can be a poem, can be something which you hang on the wall, can also be something super ephemeral. Finally, a number of exhibitions. So we not co-organized, but the Transmediale Festival, a longer running festival, electronic arts festival in Berlin. This year was inspired by the project, or kind of like in cooperation with the project, where we had the topic of refusal, so essentially saying no to technology, with a number of exhibitions as far as possible, of course, during Corona, right? So we had essentially to do everything more or less by proxy, so that people are going through with cameras for people to join online. But we organize a number of these exhibitions on, for instance, labor, productivity, network bias, how we keep memory in digital systems, solidarity through social network means, essentially using the arts, right, to engage the public on digital matters. This is a larger one under normal circumstances. We also have a number of smaller cultural events. So for instance, our colleagues at Waag in the Netherlands doing several of these smaller activities that, for instance, they hosted artists and digital intellectuals like Eugenie Mozharov, where they streamed data walks. They essentially walked through Amsterdam, essentially around the data centers of Microsoft, and made a Q&A, a question and answer session about environmental impact of data, right? So essentially using a little bit of a mixture between an exhibition and an event to engage people, to audiences, to give us a little bit of feedback on what they think. We have a summer school in Denmark, essentially bringing students together on thinking a little bit about arts-based methods, or starting to think about it, right? It's an ongoing effort and will run a few more years, organized by our colleagues at Copenhagen Business School. And just last week, we had a number of events in different places in Amsterdam and Berlin and in Liverpool on different workshops, lectures on, for instance, feminist data sets, on biopolitics, so essentially how digital information intersects with the body. So a number of they did different events and all that. In the end, and I have to admit, we don't really know yet how that looks like. We have ideas, but essentially we want to end the project on not really a product, but on some type of ideas. And make it maybe sound a little bit vaguer than it hopefully will end up being, but we essentially want to work on something that helps people to essentially scale arts-based practices, artist in residence or collaboration with any type of artist or arts-based startups on on how to essentially then together tackle some of these challenges which come with the digital transformation. So that would essentially be the idea of Artsformation in a nutshell. And I think in terms of just me talking to you, I think I would end it here. And yeah, happy for any question, challenges, comments, whatever you might have on your heart.
Thank you so much, Christian. And these Horizon 2020 projects, they are 3-year projects, and they are actually quite large, and many things you covered on your talk, and people are clapping. So yes, please, thank you. I'm sure there will be questions, but I would like to start by, it seems that we have in Creatures also, we talk about creative practices as transformative agents or source, and we also need to understand the value of them. And it seems that one of your offering was, you were thinking these kind of toolkits as a way. Could you elaborate that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm smiling a little bit because that is not something I necessarily struggle with. I do a little bit because that is a work package that we have with our artistic, which is a little bit divided between our artistic partners, with especially VAR and our 3 universities. And what I learned is, of course, that artists work a little bit differently. So we kind of like have, not that it would be in any way a conflict, it's just kind of like something which is also a learning experience for me, that artists essentially develop something very much in the process, right? Essentially by by having something maybe a little bit less structural. So I will answer your question, but we are essentially right now, on the one hand, more like doing university type of research, where we more talk to people in the field. So essentially talk, for instance, to artists in residence or people who run these type of arts-based startups, and talk with them, okay, what works well, what doesn't work well, how can you receive any type of impact, where do the people that you want to convince about a certain course of action, where do they essentially say, I can't follow you anymore? And that might be more of a like best practice type of collection. When it now comes to the toolbox, that is something which will be connected to that, but a little bit more experiential. And I don't know yet how that will essentially look like, because the idea is also then to involve artists to come up with that itself. I'm struggling a little bit to kind of like explain that properly, because our partners haven't done that yet, meaning that it's something where they want to involve kind of like these assemblies and artist residencies, where they essentially really think about the idea of input. But in the end, if it somehow all goes together, it will be like kind of like a dual approach with how universities think, like A leads to B leads to C, with kind of like how artists do things. But yeah, in the end, it should be, if it would be in my mind, it would be something like, okay, if you, it sounds not really, really business school, I know that, and of course it's only my particular perspective, but in my ideal world, it would be, have some elements of you, be it a Facebook or be it a startup, you face this particular issue, you or policymaker, right? You want to essentially want to figure out a very particular aspect of maybe an artificial intelligence directive. Should you be inclined to involve other stakeholders beyond like immediate technical and legal complex stakeholders like artists? How can you set up such a collaboration? That would be the idea, at least from my end.
Okay, we look forward to how it develops.
Yeah, that's kind of like the big unknown of this project is essentially like how will that later look like.
Does anyone else have a comment or a question? I can continue a little bit. You know, you kind of try to avoid the defining what transformation is. Is that what in the beginning of your presentation that you didn't want to nail down that this is what it is?
Yeah, a bit, because we talked about that a little bit yesterday, right? I guess you all are in a Horizon project right together. It's a little bit this difference between what did you write down like 2 years or 3 years ago, and what are you actually finding out? So we in this project, for instance, we talked about that yesterday, right? But we also underwent reviews, and kind of like our monitors were very much interested in, okay, how do you actually work with disadvantaged populations? We have that somewhere in the project, not a little bit in the project. We have that in the project, I guess that's the best way of putting that. But they essentially are a little bit, not firmly, but they suggested, okay, you have to define that persons of vulnerability are people of color or people of a particular sexual or of a particular gender identity, right? And that is, of course, fine, but of course, that's also not really always taking an open view of kind of like what the art essentially assumes, right? Because maybe the art tells us of any different vulnerabilities. And same goes with defining what digital transformation is, at least the examples, right? Because when we defined it, we, for instance, were not really that much looking into this whole aspect of speculation and cryptocurrencies or something like that, because that was not really on our mind. We were more looking into AI, but there are sometimes really other aspects which do come up. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Hey, now we have a question by Sophia. Would you like to say that out loud, Sophia, please?
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, I would love to hear more about this perspective, the pharmacological perspective, as a theoretical model of understanding the arts in the digital transformation. And I was actually also curious about how you, in your project, define the digital transformation. You just talked about that a little bit, because this concept is pretty contested, right?
Yeah.
I just wanted to know a little bit more about that to also understand your theoretical models.
May I ask what you mean by contested?
Well, like the digital transformation, I mean, there's a risk of being a bit of like falling into technological determinism, as if this is some kind of process that is just happening and we are just here observing it.
Right.
But it's shaped by interests, by actions, by people, right? So how do you understand this process?
Absolutely agree, right? That transformations in the end, some of them, right? Ecologically, not quite sure, but technology, of course, it's very much the decisions which are made by humans and which can, to a large degree, also be done differently. I think, I don't have it completely in my mind, we have some notions also. I think we discussed at least that notion that, of course, first of all, transformations is nothing new for artists, right? The artist also dealt with, even 20 years ago, with the shift from film to video, right? And before that, goes as far back as printing, right? Or reproduction, or even earlier. About the pharmacological model, we have a report on our website which goes into a little more into depth, but the basic idea is essentially that I don't want to bore you too much with that, but essentially we essentially wrote that basically a little bit coming from a literature research that essentially developed out of that, because you see in a lot of the literature on the arts, when it goes like, I think Adorno, right? So some people write about that. The art, of course, also are a little bit poisonous. They essentially dull the minds, especially if you go into the more popular arts where it might also dull our senses. It might be escapism, depending on how you stand, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But arguably it can also be always used for the good and for the bad. And of course, also art can be I'm now going a little bit over beyond what we wrote, but art can also be glorifying, right? Art can be essentially be critical or non-critical to transformations. And yeah, the phenomenological perspective is essentially working a little bit with this idea of that transformations, and especially then the arts role in commenting transformations, can always be a poison and a cure. That's essentially the idea that Fiesler essentially, which we based on this perspective, essentially wrote about, like when I think he wrote about Silicon Valley partially in the late 90s, early 2000s. So essentially the idea is, yeah, it can be both a cure and it can be a poison, and we develop a little bit kind of like not an either or, but kind of like a perspective which says, depending on how it's employed, can have different effects. And then essentially also, I think more importantly to our practical work, to break it down into different elements, ranging from something like care to capabilities to all that.
Well, it seems like there's a nice conversation with Ama's project and Artsformation project that you might want to continue. It seems
please just reach out and I get you in touch.
Thank you.
There's a question or comment from De Souza. Do you want to say that out loud, perhaps, on the business partnerships?
Hi, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, it's interesting hearing your comment to the last question, because it kind of relates to what I'm asking as well. It's interesting that you want arts to have these involvements with businesses on different levels, but what's not clear to me is will it be an equal partnership between a business and the arts, or because there's agendas that people comply to and the agendas change. And I'm also concerned about the power play as well. And you haven't talked much about that equal partnership, if it's going to exist, and what the power play is with that kind of relationship. So can you talk a bit more about that?
I don't know yet. Maybe this is a good question. I just say I don't know yet because we need to talk to more artists, because I think it goes, there's a little bit of a spectrum, because arguably for some companies, depending on what you define as power, right? Because on the one hand, of course, some artists might be really, really valuable as product testers. Examples like Autodesk come to mind, where they essentially have artists as lead users, essentially people who essentially push the product. But that is arguably not really a matter of power, right? You could then argue there are, for instance, artists in residence at Google, at Facebook. You could now make the argument, okay, and how far does a mural somewhere in the employee canteen and an artist that might more or less desperately try to get into a conversation with employees, and how far does it change anything, and does it need to change anything, and is it something that can be measured? We have to talk more to artists, but I think there's a wide spectrum also of some artists who essentially say that, and I don't know yet, and I think that's also something what we want to find out, that there's some, I have to preface, right? There's nothing wrong per se with the system. There's, of course, good reason that these companies do their business, but arguably you could argue that do artists really feel they can make their voices heard, whether they can exchange, if arguably other parties struggle a little bit of doing that, if they also kind of like value in doing things outside of the system, because some artists, of course, nowadays develop the route of saying that no, I can't, artist as a residence doesn't work. I rather do do it outside of the system. I do participatory art or do some type of startup to prove a point. Of course, you then, of course, came always into this discussion of, does that really create an impact, and where does it create a bigger impact? Arguably also connected to this overall question, how does art create an impact, if at all? But I think we are mostly like looking right now at how actually do artists perceive this power perspective, and under which circumstances which artists think they are more impactful, connected with the question what is actually impact for them, in under which type of organizational configuration. Because you could also, of course, argue that the history of artist in residency, right, is kind of like a back and forth since the 1960s, with some artists much more being connected to the core business, arguably in the 1960s, than they are nowadays. But you have to find out, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you for that. It's interesting to know that it's something that you still need to explore as well.
Yeah. We have. I think we argue we have no real idea nowadays, because it's kind of like always a little bit of a danger, no, not of a danger, but kind of like, what is an artist then really, in at least in these types of organizations, like more like a little bit of an employee perk to have be a little bit, especially in these type of technology companies, right, which are right, like you're also right here.
Super interesting. Lara, I think are you still there? Would you like to say something? You had a question.
Hi, Christian. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. And I think that in Creatures, we've been also asking, well, what do people in the sustainability transformations literature, for example, kind of pick out as the agency of art? And we came up with a really similar list, or sorry, I should say creative practice, because that's the terms that we're using in our project. And it occurred to me that we're all sort of, coming together in different settings, asking what are the agencies of creative practice in this particular domain, and actually finding quite similar things, and how we could kind of synthesize that, because we're sort of, I guess, we're connecting to some art theory and some design theory. Our Creatures umbrella is the whole of creative practice, which is really such a broad kind of umbrella, but we also wanted to do some sort of integrative work. So I really wondered, kind of, you are talking about linking into kind of theoretical discussions with kind of new media arts, and were there other domains that you were kind of connecting together when you were thinking about the agency of artwork?
I have to mention a whole other theoretical red tail, which we kind of like are constantly discussing. For instance, where does the art stop, right, and where does design start? Especially if you take kind of like speculative design into the equation. But would be lovely to bob heads around theoretical issues like impact. And I think also the issue is that impact of the arts might be very ephemeral, right? It might not be that you talk to an artist and suddenly just say, like, I go with that, simply because, if I may be so frank, a lot of the artwork, especially in this area, is not really practical, right? You can't just say like, oh, that's a good idea, I just now do this and this, and this is now, that's now it. But it might somehow perhaps ruminate a little bit, and then suddenly like maybe connected with other influences in a few months or years or something like that, might change a little bit, which is still an impact, right? But good luck measuring that, like.
Yeah, it would be really cool maybe to have more conversations about that. And
just write us an email, and we or me an email, and just connect you to our colleagues. I think they would be really, really happy to discuss.
Thanks.
Excellent. One of the things that you mentioned also, what you're doing, is policy engagement. Can you tell a little bit more about that?
That is our one work package, which is not that far progressed yet. So what the colleagues are now doing in the end, we want to organize at least 2 workshops where we bring policymakers together with artists. I just need to Google something that I want to actually I just want to show you an example. So there are some artists who work with who are regulatory art, who do regulatory art work. So again, you could now argue that is that design or is that art, but there are some really interesting artists who have somewhat of a semi-legal background, for instance, who then do artwork on, for instance, surveillance or on lots of things. Paulo Sirius is a good example of artists who essentially, in a way, engage with regulatory matters. And what we are doing right now, we are trying to figure out a little bit who are the artists who essentially speak very closely to regulation, and not regulation, but policy and regulation and legal frameworks, and want to first of all figure out also how do they operate, how do they work, how do they think, and ideally we want to bring them together with policymakers and together with other artistic inputs. So it's kind of like both. Should be a mixture between are there any particular streams or thoughts in the digital art world which relate to policy on the one hand, but also could there be anything derived from how artists do work, how artists engage their communities in order to inform how policymakers also can involve their constituencies in any particular way. I'm also a little bit unconcrete here in the language. Cool. I just see also, that's really cool project. No, but what I wanted to say is also something that we kind of like still, in ideal world, we would try to figure out, would achieve to figure out how essentially art can be used in the policy consultation process and also in the policy outreach process to hear for that particular work package a little bit also as a academically spoken as a boundary object, right? How can we involve, how can we maybe also communicate and get input from constituencies for something which might be very abstract, but maybe a little bit translated through the arts, however that will look like later in the end. But that's essentially the idea what the colleagues are working on right now.
Well, in my mind, that also has a relationship with something that is happening with the work of Joost and Lara, for example, where we talk about soft spaces. Yeah, okay, and already mentioned that in the chat. I'm also curious, you said that you are now building also this kind of MOOC and summer school. What kind of audience is that for? Is it for the artist or for the...
something which we're actually right now discussing, meaning that so one of our colleagues, she produced kind of like MOOCs before for sustainable fashions. And so she's already very experienced and has a good filmmaker also at hand. To your questions, we are right now discussing that a little bit because if I may say so, that's kind of like also a very good dissemination tool, which the union kind of like likes, right? To have something which is somewhat still there after the project ends. Of course, all reservations apply because these things still need to be maintained. But no, the idea is still a bit ongoing, the discussion on the one hand. I hope I don't bore you too much with that, but kind of with these MOOCs, it's always a little bit the question who essentially wants to learn something. And one idea right now is either to go for to offer something for artists who want to become, and as cheesy as it sounds, for artists who want to become change makers. So essentially who want to somewhat use their arts to engage people, including but especially beyond the immediate level of their artwork. So for instance, kind of like how they could work with the community, how they could work with the organizations, with policies and all that. That's essentially like an easy way to have an audience. The other option we discussed a little bit was more like for management audience, how to include the arts in CSR, social responsibility activities. I think right now it's going a little bit more into this direction of a combination of the two, combined with essentially just showing, okay, the arts is actually a really, really interesting voice when it comes to digital transformations. Yeah.
Very, very exciting. I think, yeah. Were you smart enough to write it into your application already, or is it something?
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
okay.
it's in the application. So that is something which we have written in the application. I think that is also something which, just in my experience, is an element which really works well in this application, and also which the monitors somehow saw. So somehow it's something which seems to be popular among like evaluators. Although it's not really there yet, that project, right? But it's and arguably you never know kind of like whether that is something which really has any type of effect or so. But I think just from my experience, it works a little bit better than writing, okay, we do lectures at our university, because don't want to sound cynical, right? But an evaluator can watch the MOOC later, but they cannot essentially observe the lectures.
Yeah, well, we have 2 more minutes left if someone has a comment or a question, but I think this is many overlapping nice points we heard from the Artsformation project, and so this series of lectures or seminars has been so useful in that sense, that we see what kind of overlaps and also special questions we have in these different projects. So that's what Anna also lies about the parallels and differences. So I think it's important to keep this conversation on. And
it would be lovely,
yeah. Yes. Okay, but hey, thank you, Christian, so much for coming, and thanks for the questions and comments. And
yeah, and please reach out, guys, right? So I can always connect you to the people that do the real work. I'm just more or less doing the the paperwork. I'm a little bit more than the paperwork, but like, of course there are some colleagues who are specialists in all the aspects, and I would be very happy to connect you with everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Let's keep that as a promise. And Christina, thanks again for organizing the seminar.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye,
everyone.